Hello and welcome. I'm Tavara Gadamu. Over 300 million people are currently living outside of their countries of birth, and migration has thus become an issue nations across the globe are facing head-on. But this is not an easy task to deal with. The newly elected Director General of the International Organization for Migration, Amy Hope, joins me to explore the challenges and opportunities along that line. A very warm welcome to the program.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
So when we talk about international migrants, we are talking about hundreds of millions. The latest count, I guess, is close to 300 million.
That's right.
Migrants spread across the world. And
yeah. Over 280 million people are living somewhere other than where they were born. But in that number is a vast range of people, circumstances, income levels, and opportunities, right? So clearly there are people like me who are very, very privileged migrants, and then there are people who are displaced because of things like climate change.
So the cause for migration is basically economic. Is that what you say?
It's overwhelmingly economic. It's lack of economic opportunities for people. There's also lack of resilience in the face of climate change. There's lack of ability to get ahead or even feel safe at home. So there's a wide range of factors, but increasingly people are leaving because they don't have opportunities at home.
How about conflicts? Are they not the prime generators?
Conflicts are not the prime generator, but conflicts, when coupled with difficult economic circumstances or coupled with climate, become a exacerbator of displacement. So there's a wide range. I mean, the challenge for us within the International Organization for Migration is that in terms of solutions that are available, we have only really created solutions for refugee communities, for communities who are displaced as a result of their social group or their religion, rather than the vast number of people who are on the move.
But in Africa, where you have, here on the continent, we have, over 21 million folks who are living outside of their country.
Yes. And
that's a significant number, is it not?
It's enormous. And you think about it, 7 million people were displaced because of climate disasters just this last year, right? So you start to line up what are the challenges across the continent, and it becomes pretty apparent ways and building out better solutions.
What would the solutions be?
So thank you for asking. I'd say first and foremost, we need to recognize that the global economy is such that people are finding opportunities outside their place of birth, but we do not have the pathways for people to be integrated into the workforce, to be paid fairly, to ensure that they're contributing at their full capacity. So that's a big piece of work to do, ensuring that people can get more regular pathways for migration, whether it's in the continent itself, whether it's to the Gulf, whether it's to Europe or elsewhere in the world.
Well, that's pretty tricky, is it not? I mean, regular kind of routes.
It's not tricky. There are examples of how it can work all over the world. But the problem is it's not been done at scale. So when you look at global economies of the moment, 30 of the top economies have labor shortages. And you look at demographic changes, and we know that there are aging communities across North America, some countries in South America and the Caribbean, Europe, parts of Asia. And we have booming young people across other parts of the world. But we haven't figured out how to connect the dots between people and opportunities. So that's the challenge of the future, but one that's critical if we're going to continue to enable economic development, drivers of innovation, creativity, exchange of skills, everything that makes our modern world work.
But there is also xenophobia. Does that figure in as one of the challenging aspects of that conversation?
Yeah, xenophobia is one of our major challenges. So for us at the International Organization for Migration, it's really finding the communities and the actors who are welcoming of migrants, but also recognize the need for migrants. So we are looking, for example, at the private sector. You speak to private sector companies around the world, and you'll hear a need for a sustainable workforce. You'll hear that there's a need for people to be trained for the jobs of the future. I had a conversation with a foreign minister from Spain when I was in New York just a week and a half ago. And he said, we have a solar panel company that is looking for people to assemble solar panels, but they cannot do the work because they do not have the workers. So there is, across the world, you can identify people who are looking for these opportunities. Our job is to enable those connections and do that in lieu of taking on the culture wars and really work on enabling what will work.
When you make those connections, you're trying to encourage those countries, like you said, Spain, to absorb more migrants, right?
Right.
You need some kind of policy framework.
Yes.
That quite often is not in place all over the world.
Yeah, sometimes they exist, but they're very bureaucratic and difficult to access. So if you are a young person sitting in Côte d'Ivoire, for example, you don't necessarily have any idea how to get access to the labor pathways that might exist. So that's a place where we can do more work with countries. In other cases, the pathway doesn't exist, right? There's a need, but the policy framework is lagging behind. That's the case in the United States, for example, where there's tremendous need for labor migration, but the pathways to get there are very limited.
We've started building walls now, continue to build the wall, right?
And building a wall is not the answer to addressing whether it's the number of people with humanitarian needs or the significant labor needs that exist across the country. So I've worked for a long time on the issue of migration.
Including as a senior policy advisor for President Obama.
Exactly.
And you continue to a different responsibility with President Biden, correct?
That's right. I've worked for two presidents. I've worked as a prosecutor of human traffickers. I've worked on the security angles in terms of counter-extremism and counterterrorism. And I can tell you from my personal experience, you can never build a wall that's high enough. When people are desperate, when people can find opportunity on the other side, the connections will happen. The question is, who's benefiting from those connections? If we don't have regular pathways, then you'll see smugglers benefit, you'll see criminal networks benefit, and you'll see migrants lose out, and you'll see the employers and the communities who host migrants lose out. So ultimately, in order to achieve a better outcome for everyone, helping people make a regular connection rather than figure out how to get over or under a wall is the better policy decision.
Otherwise, you have cases like Lampedusa, which is the 10th anniversary, where 500 people perished off the coast of Lampedusa. That was 10 years ago.
It's 10 years ago, and I think over the course of the decade, unfortunately, we've seen people take it as just a cost of migration policy today, that people will die in the Mediterranean, and I think that's unacceptable. I think our job in the international community is to continue to recognize that we're talking about human beings. It was somebody's mother, brother, sister, child who died, right? And I believe our responsibility working in this space is to continue to tell the stories of the people who are moving, to explain why they're moving, and to help communities recognize the loss of human potential that we're really talking about.
You cannot avoid tragedies like that. Probably some are in the making as we speak. You never know. Yeah. But then, do you feel that you are just providing the relief for the pain? That you should, don't you feel like you should do something about the causes for this instead of providing the relief, which is pretty much temporary?
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you. And frankly, by the way, just providing relief costs a lot of money, and it means that you've cost a lot of human life and human suffering. So it's for this reason that I'm really advocating coming up with better ways of approaching the issue of migration. If you just treat migration when somebody is about to get on a boat and head toward Italy, or about to cross the Darien jungle from Colombia to Panama, you have missed multiple opportunities to engage and create better outcomes for people. And by the way, it costs a lot more money when you are focused on stemming the flow of people. So, I basically, especially here when we're here in Africa meeting with senior officials, I'm emphasizing 3 points. Number one is we need to look at what's driving someone in the first place and focus really on the micro level. I mean, you could say, well, there's instability in X country. But if you just have a national strategy without looking right at the neighborhood, where are people coming from and what's causing them to leave, you won't be effective. So it's a series of micro strategies addressing why people are leaving. The second is recognizing that there's tremendous economic potential that exists there. And even as we talk about economic integration across Africa, enabling people to find opportunities across the continent is key. So whether it's recognition of skills, whether it's the ability to cross borders, whether it's the ability to get a job in an economy that's booming, there's tremendous migration in the informal sector across the continent, but more work to be done in the formal sector. And then finally, it's looking globally. Where are the opportunities across the world, whether they're in Europe, whether they're in the Gulf, and enabling communities to take advantage of it. So it's, again, when you do all of those really well, the number of people who are getting on a boat and crossing the Mediterranean should diminish because people see there are other pathways, other options for them.
So you're engaging governments and stakeholders to start with here in Ethiopia, right?
Yes.
You were elected. You started this month, right?
Last week.
Last week. And your first trip was Ethiopia. Why?
It is. I made a deliberate decision to start my official visits here for two reasons. Number one, because Ethiopia is the seat of the African Union. We have all of our member states represented here. And what has become clear to me working on this issue for several years is that there are real challenges across the continent, but there are also tremendous opportunities. And so if we're serious about creating better outcomes for people, it starts by engaging with officials from across the continent. But also, Ethiopia itself it's been a member state of IOM for almost 20 years, and it's really experienced migration in all of its forms. There are 4 million internally displaced people here in Ethiopia. There are migrants who are coming from other countries. There are migrants who are on their way to other countries. And there are migrants from Ethiopia who are going around the world. So there's an opportunity for us to engage with a key member state who is looking at the issue from all dimensions and is interested in finding more solutions.
You mean the ways of engaging the Ethiopians? Does it mean in terms of the way you provide services or the way you kind of want to help in policy issues?
It's both.
What is it that you focus on as you engage governments, for example, here in Ethiopia?
So take climate change, right? So we know that communities across the Horn of Africa have been really devastated by drought. And many of the communities are agricultural or pastoral communities, so they're relying on their livestock. If they cannot farm, if they cannot feed their livestock, all of a sudden they're without, right? They have no other options. I think there's so much more that we can do working with governments to identify and anticipate which communities are going to be displaced as a result of climate. And with something like drought, there's a real opportunity to engage well before people get to a point of desperation. We can't always do it. You have an earthquake. We can't predict an earthquake in the same way. But by the time you hit your 5th season of drought, surely there were multiple opportunities to respond to communities in need before they were effectively obliged to leave home in search of basic necessities. So that's my hope here is that, one, we change the way we engage. So we stop just reacting with humanitarian assistance and we start being much more proactive. And doing so here in the Horn of Africa is critical because we're seeing it play out in real time.
Mm-hmm. So far, this is your second day. Yes. You have one more to go, right?
Yeah.
So far, how do you gauge your engagement with the Ethiopian government officials? I don't know how many of them you've met this far. and the UN system here, the African Union.
Very positive. I mean, I think there is a deep, not just need, but really interest in thinking about migration differently. I mean, for too long, we have been framing the issue of migration just in terms of human suffering, just in terms of people who are crossing the Mediterranean. And if you just take a step back and you look at how migration has impacted development, you realize migration has tremendous transformative potential. I mean, migration leads to more economic development than any overseas development assistance ever, right? When you look at foreign investment versus the investment by the people who have migrated and are working and living abroad and sending remittances back, I mean, there's just no comparison. But we haven't talked about it that way. We haven't looked at it from the Minister of Finance's perspective, for example, or from a development perspective, even though plenty of evidence is there. So I found a real willingness to start to think and engage along those lines and building out opportunities. Now, that doesn't mean we can walk away from protecting people who are on the move. There are very real protection needs, especially when people are migrating, who are in distress or migrating through irregular channels. So we can't forget them. But my goal is to, instead of only focusing on people in distress, really building out proactive policies.
It's interesting that you keep on saying that migration is an opportunity.
Yeah.
But why is it that many institutions drag their feet when it comes to real engagement in terms of taking this as an opportunity rather than, a disaster, which many claim to think it is?
I think...
where does the problem lie?
Yeah, some of it, I think, is a failure to look at the issue comprehensively. So some of my work across my career has been in disaster response, traditional disaster response. And the lessons we've learned from that is the more that you can be proactive, the more you can build out systems, the more you can build the resilience of a community in the face of a disaster, right? I think we need to look at migration in a similar way. Right now, we're still stuck in the old school disaster response framework. We just deal with the symptom. We deal with people once they're already moved, once they're already desperate. And that's driven, in fact, by some of the funding models. People tend to be more responsive when the disaster is right in their face, when they see it, when they see a person coming across the sea or on the channel. They tend to be just human nature. If they don't see it on their news channels, they tend to forget about it. But part of my reason for engaging with you, for example, is to get people to start to think much more broadly about it and to recognize that if we're going to do this well, we need to lift our eyes up a bit from what's happening just right at borders and start to think more broadly. Now, I don't want to pretend it's easy, but the truth is humans have been migrating for millennia. I mean, just even my own ancestors, right, in the United States. The United States is a country full of migrants. On one side of the family, my ancestors were extremely poor tenant farmers living in Sweden who moved to the United States because they could get some land there and farm for themselves. On the other side of the family, my grandmother's family came from India as indentured servants into South America. So, but even though those are moments of desperation, and I know for my ancestors it was incredibly difficult to adapt to a new life, here I am, right?
You're going to be at least for 5 years, beginning now.
Yeah.
You have outlined what you want to achieve, right?
Yeah.
But first thing first, what is that you want to tackle in the next, a year or two?
So I'm starting with 3 major priorities. Number one is raising awareness about the impacts of climate change on human mobility. I was very excited a couple weeks ago, not quite a month ago, I was in Nairobi for the Africa Climate Summit. We saw 33 member states sign what's called the climate change. And that declaration is basically just an acknowledgement of the impact of climate change on human mobility and a recognition that we need to build out better resilience. So that's step one, right? We're advocating for similar declarations in the Pacific Islands, where climate change is existential. People's homes are being swallowed by the sea, as well as in Latin America and the Caribbean. So that's step one, admitting we have a problem. Step two then will be building out the programming, the resources to help communities adapt. That's priority one. Priority two is this conversation we're having about regular pathways. And we're hearing from key member states, whether it's in Europe, in the Americas, in Africa, about their interest in building out pathways that will work. And so we're just looking for who are the communities that want to do it, and let's start with pilots, and let's show how it works. And then the third, and this for me is key, is building our relationships with the private sector. Because ultimately, you think about migration, yes, it's about government policies or opportunity, but it's the private sector that's providing the job in the end, in the vast majority of cases. It's the private sector that has an interest in having a sustainable workforce, and the private sector who wants to make sure the workforce has the skills it needs. So bringing the private sector to the table as part of the solution, that's key.
Interesting. So does being a woman
help or hurt?
along that? Because you're in its 70 years plus history, IOM for the first time is having a woman as a director general.
That's right. That's right. It's exciting. It's long overdue, and it's hard to believe, especially as we know the United Nations has stood for equality for years, but it's taken...
It's a men's club.
It's been a man's club, and especially in humanitarian agencies. But I think for me, there are a couple of pieces that are relevant. Number one, as a woman, I do bring a different perspective. You know, I'm also a mother. I've also responsibilities at home as well as working, and recognizing kind of the multi-dimensional angles to any issue, but especially migration, is key. And if I can be, I hope this isn't too provocative, but I do think women are really good at getting things done without letting the ego get in the way. So it's
I'm not begging to differ.
Right. It's less about who gets the credit and more about, can we show that this is making a difference in the lives of people? And so that's what I'm really focused on. How do we make a difference?
Well, good luck, and thank you very much, Amy Hopp. It was really a pleasure having you on my show.
Thank you so much. I'm so glad to be here, and thanks for your interest in the issue.